James Thornton spat his morning coffee across the kitchen table when he saw it through the window. His grandfather's handcrafted scarecrow lay decapitated in the middle of his cornfield, stuffing scattered across freshly tilled soil like crime scene evidence. The head, with its weathered burlap face and faded straw hat, had been impaled on the mailbox post with a hot pink citation notice stabbed through it. Unsightly decor removal, courtesy of Homestead Heights Beautification Committee. This wasn't the first clash between James's century-old family farm and the luxury development that had sprung up across the road 6 months ago, but it was the first time they'd actually trespassed and destroyed his property. James's 5-acre organic farm had become an island in a sea of beige stucco and perfectly manicured lawns. While the residents of the older Whispering Pines neighborhood had always appreciated his Saturday farmers markets and pumpkin patch events, the Homestead Heights HOA, led by Veronica Harrington, had been waging a paper war against him since breaking ground. They're saying my chicken coop lowers property values by 18%. James had laughed to his sister on the phone last week. 18, not 17 or 19. They actually commissioned a real estate assessment. But this vandalism crossed a line. That scarecrow had watched over Thornton crops for 30 years, handmade by Grandpa Joe after returning from Vietnam, its face modeled after his stern but beloved drill sergeant. As James gathered the scattered remains, he noticed fresh footprints in the soft earth, expensive-looking narrow heels that sank deep into his soil, leading from a break in the fence directly back toward Homestead Heights. His fingers trembled with rage as he collected bits of straw and torn denim overalls, remnants of a family treasure. The community had changed drastically since his grandfather's time. Just 3 years ago, the land across the road had been Philip's dairy farm, where James would trade vegetables for fresh milk and cheese. Now it was Homestead Heights, luxury living with country charm, a slogan that made James snort every time he saw it on the glossy billboards. Inside his farmhouse kitchen, a warm space with exposed beams and well-worn countertops, James spread the scarecrow remnants across the table. The carefully stitched face, now partially torn, stared up at him with its mismatched button eyes. One was missing. Dad would have marched over there with his shotgun, came a voice from the doorway. James's Uncle Frank, 73 and still helping with the farm despite his arthritis, shook his head at the destruction. Course, back then, you could scare sense into folks without actually shooting anyone. Times change, James sighed, picking up the pink citation. The paper was expensive, heavyweight stock with embossed lettering. What doesn't change is entitled people thinking they own everything they can see. His phone buzzed with a text from Ellie Chen, who owned the small flower farm adjacent to his property. Heads up, Harrington woman and 2 committee members taking photos of your Northfield fence from the road. Something about rustic aesthetic incompatible with community vision. Their words, not mine. James texted back a quick thanks before walking to his office, formerly his parents' bedroom before they retired to Florida, and pulling out the thick folder labeled HOA harassment. Inside were 27 notices, letters, and citations he'd received in the 6 months since Homestead Heights welcomed its first residents. He added the pink decapitation notice to the collection. Through the window, he could see the empty post where the scarecrow had stood watch for decades. The morning sun highlighted the vacant space like a spotlight on a stage, emphasizing the violation. In that moment, something hardened in James, a farmer's stubborn resolve fertilized by righteous anger. He reached for his phone and dialed. "McGill, it's James. Remember that lawyer friend of yours who helped with the water rights issue last year? I need her number. And after that, I need to borrow your truck. I've got some supplies to pick up in town." The Homestead Heights Community Center resembled a small Mediterranean villa, complete with bubbling fountains and imported Italian cypress trees. Inside, Veronica Harrington was holding court during the HOA's quarterly property standards review, a slideshow of violations projected on the wall behind her. James didn't bother knocking. He pushed through the double doors, still clutching the scarecrow's severed head. "Is this what passes for neighborhood diplomacy these days?" His voice echoed through the suddenly silent room as 24 perfectly coiffed residents turned to stare. Veronica didn't flinch. The slim, 50-something woman with a precision-cut blonde bob simply clicked to the next slide, a professional photo of James's farm with red circles highlighting the scarecrow, chicken coop, and vintage tractor. "Mr. Thornton," she said with practiced patience, "we were just discussing your property. Perfect timing. You trespassed and vandalized the family heirloom," James said, holding up the head. "That's not a violation, that's a crime." A few uncomfortable murmurs rippled through the crowd. Veronica's smile remained fixed. "Our beautification committee has authority to remove eyesores visible from community property. Perhaps if you read the notices we sent." "My farm predates your development by 90 years, James interrupted. "Your HOA has zero jurisdiction over my property." "That's becoming a matter for legal interpretation," Veronica countered, producing a thick folder. "We've documented 17 distinct violations of county aesthetic ordinances. My husband plays golf with Commissioner Williams every Thursday. Perhaps you've heard of him. He's been very interested in our community's concerns about your rural activities." As she continued her practice speech about modernization and community standards, James noticed something he hadn't before. Veronica's signature pose, right hand on hip, left arm extended, chin lifted in perpetual judgment, mirrored almost exactly the stance his grandfather had carved into the original Scarecrow. The crowd shifted uncomfortably when James suddenly smiled. "Thank you for the clarification, Ms. Harrington," he said, pulling out his phone. "Mind holding that pose while I take a reference photo? You've just inspired me." Veronica faltered mid-sentence, her perfectly manicured hand dropping slightly. "Photography is prohibited during official HOA proceedings," she snapped, while a balding man in the front row quickly raised his hand. "Point of order," he said, adjusting his glasses. "There's nothing in the bylaws about photography, Veronica." "Thank you, Dr. Myers." James nodded to the man, recognizing him as the retired biology professor who occasionally bought heirloom tomatoes at his farm stand. Veronica's cheeks flushed with two perfect circles of pink as she attempted to regain control of the room. Moving on to item 7. "We haven't resolved item 6, interrupted a woman in a floral dress. "The farm issue. I'd like to hear Mr. Thornton's side before we proceed." Several heads nodded in agreement. James recognized a subtle power dynamic at play. Not everyone in the room was under Veronica's thumb. "There's nothing to discuss," Veronica said sharply. "The beautification committee acted within its authority." "By trespassing on private property?" James asked, addressing the room rather than Veronica. "I checked with the sheriff's office this morning. Crossing a fence line to destroy property is criminal trespass and vandalism, regardless of any HOA bylaws." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. A silver-haired man in the back stood up. "I served on the beautification committee until last month," he said slowly. "I was told any removals would be restricted to common areas and road easements, not private property." Veronica's smile tightened into a thin line. "Fred, we can discuss committee procedures privately." "Did you personally remove my scarecrow, Mrs. Harrington?" James interrupted, holding her gaze. The question hung in the air. Several residents leaned forward. "Of course not," she finally answered. "I delegate such matters." "Interesting," James said, pulling out his phone again and bringing up a photo. "Because these high-heel prints lead directly from my broken fence to the Scarecrow site, and they match the exact pattern of the shoes you're wearing right now." He held up the phone, showing a clear image of distinctive tread patterns in the morning dew of his field. Several HOA members gasped audibly. "This meeting is adjourned," Veronica declared, gathering her papers with trembling hands. "Actually," Dr. Myers interjected, flipping through a binder, "the bylaws specify that meetings require a formal motion to adjourn." And, "Fine," Veronica snapped. "Motion to adjourn." "Opposed," called out several voices at once. As the room dissolved into procedural arguments, James noticed how Veronica's body language shifted into pure defensive posture, chin up, shoulders back, one accusatory finger jabbing at dissenters, a perfect mirror of his grandfather's original Scarecrow design. James quietly took several photos with his phone, documenting every angle of her distinctive stance, before slipping out of the chaotic meeting. The seed of an idea was already taking root, growing stronger with each step back toward his farm. James's workshop became his sanctuary for the next 2 weeks. Few people knew that before returning to save the family farm, he had spent 5 years as a prop designer for Broadway shows in New York. Those skills were rusty, but far from forgotten. "This isn't just about getting even," he explained to his friend Miguel, who owned the neighboring organic dairy farm. "It's about making a statement." The new Scarecrow took shape methodically. James started with a sturdy oak frame, more durable than the previous pine version. He sculpted the face using specialized techniques he'd learned creating theatrical masks. Not an exact replica of Veronica, but with the same perpetually pursed lips and narrowed eyes. As he worked, the local farming community rallied around him. Ellie from the flower farm dropped off reference photos she'd discreetly taken at the Homestead Heights Summer Gala. Dr. Myers provided unexpected support with a casual comment during his weekly vegetable pickup. Hypothetically speaking, if one were creating an artistic statement about authoritarian overreach, that person might find useful legal precedents in the Hustler v. Falwell case regarding parody. When James looked puzzled, the professor smiled. "Just a thought from someone whose retirement hobby is constitutional law. By the way, I'll take an extra dozen eggs today." The workshop filled with the scent of cedar shavings and linseed oil as James meticulously carved the facial features. His grandfather's tools felt right in his hands, the same hands that had once crafted elaborate masks for the Lion King on Broadway. Each evening, he'd step back, make adjustments, and continue refining. This wasn't just revenge, it was art. On day 9, Miguel arrived with a donation. "My wife was cleaning out her mother's closet," he said, holding up a purple blazer. "Said it looked exactly like the one that HOA woman wears." Pure coincidence, of course. The blazer was perfect, the same shade as Veronica's designer jacket, though this one came from a department store. James added thrift store costume pearls, and his niece, a hairstylist in town, styled a blonde wig into Veronica's signature sharp bob. The finishing touch was the pose, right hand on hip, left arm extended with one accusatory finger pointed, chin tilted upward in perpetual judgment. "You're playing with fire," warned Miguel, helping James transport the finished creation on a crisp Saturday morning. "That woman has half the county board in her pocket." "I've done my homework," James replied, showing him a legal brief. "My attorney says it's protected artistic expression since it doesn't bear her name and isn't an exact likeness, just a general caricature of overbearing authority, according to the paperwork." They positioned the Scarecrow at the farm's entrance, visible from the main road but technically on private property. James had prepared the spot meticulously, installing solar-powered spotlights that would illuminate the creation at night. Beside it, he installed a handcrafted wooden sign reading, "Thornton Family Organic Farm, warding off pests since 1923. "It's perfect," Miguel admitted, stepping back to admire their work. "She'll recognize herself immediately, but no one can legally claim it's actually her." "That's the beauty of artistic expression," James said, snapping photos from different angles. "It speaks truth without saying a word." The tipping point came at the height of autumn harvest season, when Homestead Heights held its monthly board meeting under the shadow of increasing negative publicity. The meeting had just begun when 3 unexpected faces appeared, residents from within the development itself. Dr. Myers stood first. "As a retired judge, I've reviewed our HOA's legal position thoroughly," he announced. "It's untenable and potentially exposes all homeowners to significant liability for Mrs. Harrington's actions." Beside him, a younger woman in business attire introduced herself as a marketing executive. "Our development's brand is being destroyed on social media," she explained. "But there's an opportunity here for repositioning. My team has drafted a proposal for a community agriculture appreciation committee that would partner with local farms for educational programs and sustainable living initiatives." The third resident, a retired chef, spoke about farm-to-table dining events that could become a signature feature of the development. People pay thousands to experience this in Napa Valley, he argued. We have it in our backyard. As the meeting exploded into heated debate, Veronica's control visibly fractured. When the vote came -13 to 8 in favor of dropping the lawsuit and forming the partnership committee, she gathered her designer handbag and stalked out, the echo of her heels on marble fading into silence. 6 weeks later, she resigned as HOA president, citing the community's failure to uphold standards. Her replacement, Dr. Myers, invited James to the next HOA meeting where they established formal boundaries and mutual respect. The Scarecrow remained, gradually weathering as intended. James eventually added more artistic scarecrows representing different authority figures: a banker, a tax collector, a corporate farmer, creating what the local arts council officially designated as the Guardians, an agricultural installation on power and preservation. The final irony came a year later when the Homestead Heights welcome brochure featured the Scarecrow collection as a unique local cultural attraction that made their community special. Home values increased by 22%, not despite the neighboring farm, but because of it. The crowning touch came the following morning when local news vans appeared. James had anonymously tipped off reporters about a cultural statement on rural preservation through agricultural art. A young journalist with ambitions beyond the local station immediately recognized the social media potential. This is Alicia Vega reporting live from Thornton Farms, where agricultural tradition meets artistic commentary in what locals are calling the Scarecrow incident, she announced, gesturing dramatically toward the creation already drawing small crowds of curious onlookers. By noon, the Scarecrow had its own hashtag trending locally on social media. #OCrow was born, and with it, James's message began spreading far beyond his fence line. The Scarecrow became an overnight sensation. Cars lined up along the rural road, visitors taking selfies with what social media had dubbed #HOACrow. Local artists praised its pointed commentary on the rural-suburban divide, while a nearby university's sociology department requested permission to feature it in a study on passive resistance through folk art. James capitalized on the attention, setting up a farm stand near the Scarecrow where he sold organic produce at premium prices to the steady stream of visitors. His Saturday farmers' markets suddenly doubled in attendance. "You've started a movement," Ellie told him as she helped arrange sunflower bouquets at his newly expanded farm stand. The parking area, once just a gravel patch, now struggled to accommodate weekend visitors. 3 other farms in the county have installed their own versions of bureaucrat scarecrows. There's one that looks suspiciously like the county tax assessor over at Wilson's Orchard. Veronica's reaction was swift and multi-layered. First came the cease and desist letter, delivered by a courier who ironically asked James to autograph his copy of Farmers Monthly, featuring a full-page spread on the Scarecrow controversy. Next came an actual lawsuit claiming defamation and emotional distress, served by a sheriff's deputy who purchased a dozen eggs while completing the service. She's claiming $250,000 in damages for severe anxiety and public humiliation. James's lawyer explained during their meeting at the farm kitchen table, but her strategic error came when she convinced the county to dispatch inspectors. That's opened up a whole different legal avenue for us. The inspection became a media circus. News cameras followed the uncomfortable county officials as they toured the immaculate farm, while James cheerfully pointed out his state-certified organic practices, solar power system, and rainwater collection methods that exceeded county environmental standards. "And this," James said to the lead inspector while cameras rolled, "is our heritage seed bank. We're preserving 37 varieties of vegetables that were commonly grown in this county a century ago, but have nearly disappeared due to commercial farming practices." The inspector, a serious woman with a clipboard, seemed genuinely impressed. "This operation is remarkably sustainable," she admitted on camera, to the visible discomfort of her colleagues. "We also discovered something interesting in the county archives," James told reporters afterward, his lawyer at his side. The original deed for my property includes a heritage farm designation from 1957 that exempts it from residential zoning restrictions. It seems someone at the county office didn't do their homework before approving development permits for Homestead Heights. That revelation split the HOA board. Half wanted to pursue the lawsuit. The other half, concerned about plummeting community approval and potential impacts on home values, pushed for reconciliation.